Hello, and welcome to Cheers to Fears, where we take horror films and turn them into drinking games. We're your two hosts. I'm Tucker.
And I'm Alex. And today we will be turning A Quiet Place 2, written and directed by John Krasinski, into a drinking game. John Krasinski was hesitant to come back for the sequel, but the studio asked him to write a story for the movie, and he had a change of heart and decided to direct the movie after all.
A Quiet Place 2 picks up exactly where the first movie left off, while also answering the question as to where and how it all began.
What happened? A bomb, I think.
Lee, played by John Krasinski, is dead, and Regan found a weakness to the creatures that are invading the planet. The family then decide that they cannot stay where they are as their house is ruined. They do have a destination in mind as the family saw a fire in the distance and decide to embark forward and find more people.
From there, Regan finds out about a radio signal and deciphers the code to find out where there are even more people. Regan then decides that she wants to find them and use her invention to broadcast to the people the only known weakness for seemingly unbeatable creatures.
Again, since this is a new movie, we will try to avoid spoilers if possible. With that being said, we will be talking about some of the points in our discussion, but we will not be adding final counts in our drinking rules to not only avoid some spoilers such as deaths, but it's also really awkward to tally the count in the theater.
Additionally, we will be showing some clips that were released online if you do consider that spoiling the movie for you. With that out of the way, let's continue to the rules.
Rule number 1 is death. You see a death, you must take a drink. Without going into too much detail, without a shadow of a doubt, this movie had more deaths than the previous one.
On to the second horror rule that is used for every horror movie, which is somebody screams, cries, or yells, you are obliged to take a sip. Again, without counting, there should on paper be more screaming, crying, and yelling in this movie than the first installment.
Our next rule is that you need to have a sip when somebody says shh, covers their mouth, or any other form of action telling somebody to keep quiet. This rule is also in the first movie, as well as some of the next few rules we will be looking at.
Another rule coming back is when you hear a sudden loud sound, you drink. Again, there is no drinking totals for this one or the other ones, so this is something you have to find out for yourself. There are definitely a few instances where loud sounds came out of nowhere and caught us off guard. Not quite a jump scare, but definitely startling.
This next rule will certainly result in more drinks than the first movie. That rule being, you have to drink when you see the monsters on screen. We were glad to see more of the monster this time around.
The sixth and final rule from the previous movie is that you must take a sip when anybody in the movie uses sign language. This rule can go either way, but when people communicate with Regan, there will certainly be more drinks to add.
Onto the rules that are for A Quiet Place 2 specifically. The first one is when you see an oxygen tank, you take a drink. There shouldn't be a ton of drinks for this rule, but just enough to justify including it in our drinking game.
The next completely new rule is when you see a radio or an amplifier, you are encouraged to have a sip. This is probably going to result in a lot more than expected, since most of the plot revolves around one of these two things.
Our next rule is when you see a gun, you must take a drink. Since the last movie was too passive to add it in, we decided to include it in the sequel instead. Fair warning, there will be quite a few drinks for this rule.
Finally, we came to our final rule for the drinking game for A Quiet Place 2. This rule is that you drink whenever you see a vault door being opened or closed. This is yet another rule that had a lot of occurrences in the movie.
And that does it for all the rules for A Quiet Place 2. As we do not have the exact numbers, we are unable to tell a total number of drinks for this movie. But we figure that there were more drinks in this movie than the previous one. The reason that there was a lot more drinks in this one, we figure, is because in some of our rules, there was a lot more instances where they happened, such as death. There was a lot more death on screen.
Yeah, I guess the main instance of this is there was a lot more cities, there was a lot more civilization. You saw times kind of before, and you saw people that managed to live on like other places kind of, trying to avoid the monsters. So there was more than 6 people in this movie.
Right.
So obviously there's going to be more deaths. Other things that were more of, there was a lot more monsters. You actually kind of got to see them full in the movie.
Right, yeah.
They weren't more hidden, they weren't as mysterious, they were kind of just out in the open.
Yeah.
I guess that brings us to other things that there were, such as oxygen tanks, radios, amplifiers, guns. There was a lot more of those things in this movie rather than trying to spot out a fire every 3 scenes maybe.
Yeah. Well, especially with guns, they were always carrying a gun.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It cut away and then cut back to them and with the gun again, and it was just there. I have a feeling there's quite a bit of guns in this movie, and it's not that there's a lot of different guns. It's a lot of the same gun or a couple guns being shown. But then another thing that also happened more frequently, I feel like, is sign language, because Millicent Simmons, the actor who plays Regan, or Reagan, however you want to pronounce it, is kind of taking more of a lead role in this movie, and so that's why sign language is kind of used more, because we see more of her.
Yeah, the main thing is she was the focal point of the movie, so she was going to be shown a lot more. So I think it's good that she became the focal point. I feel like she was good in her own role.
Yeah. The reason that she was the focal point of this film was because John Krasinski had the idea to make Millicent Simmons kind of the lead actress in this. And initially he didn't want to make a second Quiet Place just because it would have been so hard to live up to the first one.
Yeah.
So him and also Emily Blunt were kind of opposed to that idea, but Paramount kind of twisted his arm and kind of convinced him to make the movie, so he went off of that idea, and that's why we see so much more of Regan in this film. So in the first one, we kind of see her rebelling against her father and kind of going against what he says. But then in the second one, she kind of turns into this badass that's smarter than everybody, and she kind of tries to follow in the footsteps of her father.
Yeah.
And so she keeps trying to finding a way to put an end to this current way of life and progress society and civilization forward, I guess.
So I guess, yeah, that's the main thing about Millicent Simmons, is her character Reagan in this movie. She was, I guess you'd say, smarter than most people. Like, her, a deaf person trying to figure out the code, which was, she cracked in, I think, about a few minutes. I guess on top of that, there's also the point about her being, like, a lot more brave in the movie. Like, so for example, I think Emmett is his name. He said, like, we should just stay back, we shouldn't go forward, but she's like, no, I want to end this thing, and she wants to go and broadcast her signal throughout all the radio waves, just so they can get rid of the monsters.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess just another production decision, I guess, that they decided to use was Millicent Simmons, when she was on screen and the focal point in that scene, they kind of took away all the sound just to put us in her shoes. And I like that method of putting us in her place, just because it gives us a little bit more feeling and, like, it puts us in that world a little better.
Yeah.
And like I said, they did it in the first one, but they just brought it back in the second one, and I wanted to make a point about how I do like that. But you mentioned Emmett. I would say that he's also pretty smart.
Oh, yeah.
But he's not as brave, like you mentioned.
Yeah, well, like, he's another one of those characters that has a little bit of a character arc. I guess he's one of those guys, like, he can think quickly on his feet. So one example of this is, I won't get too far into spoilers, but he dives in the movie. Or he gets somebody else to dive in the movie from sign language that he learned years ago.
Yeah, and there was a bit of foreshadowing to that, which I didn't catch on to in the first week when it actually happened, but in the end it's like, oh, that was obvious.
Yeah. Another thing that he did that I really liked is he had some plans, especially in his whole setup over at the abandoned factory, I'd call it maybe. He had the idea of going into an airtight vault where nobody could hear him, so he was kind of safe to kind of do his own thing in there. He had a timer to kind of keep track of his oxygen levels so he wouldn't suffocate in there, as well as he had, like, the bear traps and bottles kind of set around his, like, man cave, whatever you want to call it, I don't know.
Fort, I guess.
Yeah, around his fort. He had all these booby traps to let himself know if there was anyone in the area. So I feel like that was really smart. He was definitely one of the smarter characters in this movie.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like Emmett, I guess the actor that played him was Cillian Murphy is his name. And I felt like he was a pretty good male lead. I didn't feel like he was as impactful as Lee, which was John Krasinski's character. Probably because he has no family connection to them. You did kind of get to see how he was impacted by his wife's death and also his son's death. And he kind of wanted to be alone at the beginning, but then he was basically forced out of his shell by Emily Blunt's character because Regan went out on her own, and so she was worried.
Yeah.
And that was the arc we got to see with him.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and I did like that arc, and I feel like he did a pretty good job in that role.
That's, like, one of the main reasons why I'd even say that he's almost better than Lee. You could actually see Emmett evolving in comparison to Lee, where a lot of it's kind of implied that he's evolving or never really changed, but he just hasn't expressed his feelings towards Regan, for example, in the first one. Whereas this one, you can actually see Emmett physically changing on screen.
That's fair.
Yeah. I guess something to point out quick, because we aren't doing Darwin Awards, is kids should listen to their parents. obviously the first one, Bo died. In this one, there's another kid who does something almost equally as stupid. I wouldn't say equally as stupid, but still pretty dumb. Also, speaking of kids, there is a scene in the movie where I think it's Marcus. He gets his leg trapped in a bear trap, and oh my god, such good acting. That is excruciating to listen to.
Oh yeah.
When he did that on screen, I could feel that pain.
Oh yeah, definitely. It looked real based on how visceral the scream that sounded.
Oh yeah.
And like, even apart from that scene, like, I feel like the child actors in this film do a really good job altogether.
Yeah.
But that scene for sure gets the point across of how much agony and pain that he's feeling.
Yeah.
And there's actually another point in the movie where he's screaming again when they're putting the alcohol on his wound, and that again makes you feel for him.
Oh yeah.
But that first one is just intense.
So I guess the other thing that comes to mind is there was a trap in, I think it was Saw 7, where the guy had to rip out a hook of a girl's mouth, and she was screaming the entire time. And I was saying, that's easily able to be done. She's just crying too much. Whereas the bear trap, I'm like, oh my god, that sucks to be that kid.
Yeah, and maybe it's because he was showing so much more agony.
Oh yeah.
Even though he knows he's not supposed to scream, he couldn't hold it in.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the same thing with that saw trap you mentioned. And she knew she couldn't scream because of her situation, but then she did. But the scream didn't sound as crazy and intense as this one did. So maybe that's why we thought it was too easy to hold in.
Oh yeah.
Another point that comes to mind about Bo is there was a few references sprinkled throughout the movie with references to Bo, Lee, and Emmett's wife, who are all deceased. They weren't littered throughout the entire movie, but there was a few references here and there, which I kind of liked how they did have those connections to them, but at the same time they didn't hammer them in and it wasn't forced. It was just a little bit of a nod to them and saying like, yeah, we acknowledge their existence, but we're not going to focus too much on them.
Yeah, the thing that I really liked about that when they did it, a lot of it was visual. A lot of it wasn't actually like talked about and hammered in that way, which I do feel like is expected from a movie that's purely based on visuals rather than sound.
Yeah. Like, one example that comes to mind is in the very opening sequence of the movie, when he's in the grocery store or whatever, he walks past a shelf and it kind of freezes on the spaceship that Bo is holding in his death scene.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a nice little nod to him without fully saying, oh, that's Bo's toy. It made it clear just by showing it.
I guess another thing to note is a lot of the deaths in the movie were very predictable. So there was one very specifically that I called out. I'm like, this guy's gonna die in 20 seconds, and that guy died in 20 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a few moments in the film where you could kind of predict what was gonna happen. And that probably comes with learning the environment and the world that they're in, and just kind of common horror tropes to go along with it.
Yeah.
But that is one thing that kind of took A Quiet Place 2 down a notch, is some of the predictability of it. And another thing that you could argue takes it down a notch, depending on how you look at it, is the ending of the film. So they kind of ended it in the same way as the first one, where it had an abrupt ending. What did you think about that ending?
I disliked it for one reason specifically. And the main reason with that is they ended it in such a way that you'd expect a Netflix show to end. So it would just like be something kind of dramatic that would set it up for like next episode or next season even.
Yeah.
But then it would just suddenly stop and like hit credits.
Yeah, so I get that point of view for the ending. I actually kind of liked it, however. The reason that I liked it is it does end abruptly, but they also do tell the full story, and they don't cut it off before the story is kind of resolved. It's kind of a cliffhanger, but at the same time, not really, because of that resolution they come to at the end.
Yeah.
But the reason that I like it is because it's kind of different from the norm. So like normally you would have the resolution to the film, and then you'd have a conclusion where all the characters are gathering together and celebrating, or like, you know, they're having a moment to just take everything that they just experienced in.
Yeah.
Whereas this movie didn't have that moment of everybody gathering together, which is different, and that's another unique approach that Krasinski took as a director.
Oh yeah.
That's kind of why I respect it a little bit, and it's just something different, I guess.
Yeah, I can respect it too. I mean, I don't have to like it, but I can respect what he's trying to do, I guess.
And that's another point, is they're probably setting up a third one, let's be honest.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's actually been announced or not yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, they said they didn't want to do a second one, but here we are expecting a third.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess since we talked about the ending, how did you like the film overall?
So overall, I did like the movie. Obviously, they had to keep some of the concepts the same, like the whole world with no sound, because of the first film, which already created the universe, and now they're just expanding on the already existing universe.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit less unique because of that, but they also added some new concepts into it just to make it, fresh, to progress the story forward as well. Like, for example, they introduced Emmett, a new character, and they also gave him enough backstory to make him a likable character. And then another example is Regan taking the lead actress role. She did a good job of progressing the story forward, and just the overall pacing of the movie was really well done.
I would agree to that. Like, I feel like this is one of the better films that was very well paced, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The pacing to the film was really consistent throughout. At no point was I ever like, this is going too fast or this is going too slow. I felt like it was just going right throughout the entire course of the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's some movies that I go to in the theaters, and it's like, I have an urge to look at my phone to see what time it is, just to be like, oh, how much is left in this movie? Or like, it seems like the pacing's off or something. But this movie, I had no even thought about checking the time or anything like that. So that just goes to prove that I felt engaged the whole time.
Oh yeah. Normally, this is where we would present our Darwin Awards, but since we don't do the awards for new movies to avoid spoilers, there will not be nominees nor a winner today.
And with all that being said, we hope you enjoyed today's look at A Quiet Place 2. If you end up playing the game alongside the movie, or if you have any feedback or suggestions, let us know in the comments below. Our question for today is, who do you think should win the Darwin Award for A Quiet Place 2? Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next week's episode, where we start up the Conjuring universe with the first Conjuring movie.
For the next 3 weeks, we will be releasing 3 episodes a week. Week 1 will be the 3 Conjuring films, Week 2 will be the Annabelle films, and Week 3 will be the remaining 2, plus our liquored list video for the Conjuring universe. If you want to check out a video on the first Quiet Place, click on the box on the top right. Or, if you want to see a playlist of all of our drinking games and movie reviews, click on the box below it. Thanks for tuning in, and this is us saying, Cheers to Fears.